as it becomes clear that the Massachusetts Supreme Court is not going to overturn the verdict, as the death sentence is passed, then people really start realizing that Sacco and Vanzetti are going to die. This is going to happen. And that energizes people. And let's face it, there's a bandwagon effect. And the communists in particular see the propaganda value of the case. They recognize Sacco and Vanzetti as potential martyrs for the working class.
Really, the left is defined increasingly as communist in the 1920s. And so the Communist Party in this country, and especially internationally, had an enormous role in publicizing the Sacco and Vanzetti case. And in a way, their involvement was a double-edged sword. They could treat the case very cynically at times.
Now, one member of the Communist Party, when asked, don't they think that the loss of a life like Sacco and Vanzetti is a terrible shock? And the answer was reported in the media. He said that, as far as I'm concerned, they're better off dead. Of what use are they to us alive? That was reported in the media. And it's a callous type of a remark.
Boston Brahmins were a notoriously conservative and stodgy bunch, but there were also a number of very liberal Boston Brahmins, and certain of them took up the cause of Sacco and Vanzetti immediately and in really sort of substantial ways. Elizabeth Glendower Evans was a very wealthy and liberal Bostonian woman, and she became convinced early on that Sacco and Vanzetti were innocent, and she wrote regularly to Sacco and Vanzetti. She would send them flowers and fruit and food, and she contributed enormously economically to their defense.
There was 7 years of intense national attention, international attention, and all sorts of demonstrations taking place in this country and abroad, and the court appeals going on and on. And finally, Governor Fuller decides to quell the protests, or to try to do it, by setting up, a blue ribbon commission. 3 people whose integrity could not possibly be challenged. President of Harvard, president of MIT, and a retired judge. You might say 3 typical Americans. Peers of Sacco and Vanzetti, of course.
The head of this 3-man committee is A. Lawrence Lowell, the president of Harvard University, whose family fortune was gained by the exploitation of textile workers in Lawrence and Lowell, Massachusetts.
Governor Fuller sets up the Lowell Committee, and it's clear immediately that what their role is to uphold the verdicts. A. Lawrence Lowell actually drafts the committee's response, drafts its report before the defense makes its final arguments.
And of course, Haywood Broun, the remarkable columnist for the Pulitzer paper, the New York World, wrote several columns about who it was who condemned these 2 men to die. Governor Alvin T. Fuller, he was the governor at the time, never had any intention in all his investigations but to put a new and higher polish upon the proceedings. He called old men from high places to stand behind his chair so that he might seem to speak with all the authority of a high priest or a pilot. What more can these immigrants from Italy expect? It is not every prisoner who has a president of Harvard University throw on the switch for him.
The committee decides that Sacco and Vanzetti have been granted a fair trial, and people are devastated. And the execution is scheduled for August 10th, and then at the 11th hour, there's a temporary stay, and the new date is scheduled for August 23rd.
There are demonstrations daily, and it's not just in Boston.
Sacco e Vanzetti furono arrestati a Boston una sera con sorpresa.
There are demonstrations really throughout the country and throughout the world There are demonstrations, occasionally violent demonstrations, in really every major city in Europe, in Japan, in China, in northern and southern Africa. There's really no place in the world that's untouched by this trial by the summer of 1927.
My father asked me if I wanted to go to a rally to support Sacco and Vanzetti. I said, sure, I'll go, Pop. So I went with him, and I had never been to a big rally before. I was about 13 years old then. So when I got there, I saw all these people, so many people, shouting, had signs, and I couldn't believe that so many people were together in a rally to support Sacco and Vanzetti, and it made me feel very good. And I was glad that I had been there.
Letters are pouring into the governor's office. Protests are mounting. People begin to feel the sense that it could possibly be over, and not in a way that anybody had hoped. And Sacco's wife, Rosina, goes to the office of the governor of Massachusetts, Alvin Fuller, and reportedly gets on her knees and begs the governor to spare her husband's life, with tears in her eyes, and she's denied.
Well, what a heartache, what a heartbreaking experience that must have been to so many people. You can't help but identify with those who were experiencing this long, drawn-out 7-year ordeal, leading to the end of all hopes for them to save these two innocent men.
On the night of August 22nd, there are 3 men who were sentenced to die: Celestino Medeiros, Sacco, and Vanzetti. Celestino Medeiros had been convicted of another crime. He had eaten himself into a stupor. He had tossed and turned in bed until it was time for him to go. Sacco and Vanzetti were quite composed. They sat writing last letters to loved ones, meeting with visitors.
And you know, at the very end, very end, before the execution, Sacco wrote a letter to his son, which was so moving, you know. It was a letter that was full of hope and optimism, and absolutely extraordinary, just before he's going to his death.
Son, instead of crying, be strong, so as to be able to comfort your mother. And when you want to distract your mother from the discouraging soulness, I will tell you what I used to do. To take her for a long walk into the quiet country, gathering wildflowers here and there, resting under the shade of the gentle tranquility of Mother Nature. But remember always, Dante, in the play of happiness, don't you use all for yourself only, but help the weak ones that cry for help. Help the persecuted and the victim, because they are your better friends.
And he says, always remember that we are not criminals, and one day you will be proud of us. And Dante, I kiss you and I clasp you in a firm embrace. Then he taps on the cell door and he says, ask the guard, take this to my son.
In Boston, martial law is declared, and the streets are absolutely silent. In New York, there's a vigil in Union Square. And at just after midnight, the executions take place.
There were actually 3 executions that night. The first one was Medeiros. He went very quietly. Sacco also went pretty quietly.
He says goodbye to his family. He shouts, "Long live anarchy." And then just as the electricity is applied, he says, "Farewell, mother." And then Vanzetti is the last to go. He walks into the death chamber. He shakes the warden's hand and thanks him for all that he's done for him. This is an act of composure that is apparently very moving to people who are witnessing the execution.
Vanzetti made a statement, in which he declared that he was innocent of all crimes, that he had done some sins but no crime. And in his last words, as the hood was being put over him before he was electrocuted, he is reported to have said, "I now want to forgive some of these people for what they are doing to me."
1927, it was a hot summer night in 1927. It was hot in Boston. It was hotter in New York, I think. We were trying to watch the electricity because we were told that the force of the electricity going through the electric chair would in some way diminish the power of the lights. And so I think we were looking for that. I think the feeling was, I wouldn't want to say relief, but the tension is over now. It's settled now. They're gone. Question of their living is over now. The rest of the question is, did they deserve that fate? That's something else again.
So it's the funeral. The cortege takes the bodies of Sacco and Vanzetti through the streets of Boston. They're denied access to the State House. The police are everywhere and just won't allow them to go that way. Members of the crowd are wearing armbands supplied by the Defense Committee, which read "Justice Crucified." The bodies are taken to the crematorium, and it's over. And the case is over.
It's interesting how people's consciousness can be radically changed by one event that's taking place during their lifetime. It happened in Sacco and Vanzetti. People followed the case for years. People became so close to the case. People became so wrapped up in their humanity. These were not two ordinary men. These were men of poetic sensibilities. These were men of infinite courage.
It's interesting that for a lot of artists that grew up in the 1920s, it was the case that really radicalized them politically. And I think that becomes something that artists go back to over and over again. I mean, it's a great story.
It's probably not too bold to say that there is no court case in American history that has inspired as much art across as many genres as the Sacco and Vanzetti case did.
And novelists like John Dos Passos, artists like Hugo Gellert. You have George Gross, who does a pen and ink allegorical drawing. Diego Rivera did a mural panel for the New Workers' School on 14th Street in 1933-34. Ben Shahn cared about the Sacco and Vanzetti case because for him, it became a lifelong identification with both their immigrant status and their political radicalism.
There is indeed a huge outpouring of creative work around the Sacco and Vanzetti case. Upton Sinclair's Boston, Catherine M. Porter's Never Ending Wrong, Maxwell Anderson's Winter Set.
It also inspired a number of poets who were remarkably apolitical previously. Edna St. Vincent Millay particularly marched in demonstrations, wrote a couple of very moving poems about the trial.
When I was in college, I took English Lit, and the professor was having all of us read a different thing to the class and analyzing it, and she passed me a poem by Edna St. Vincent Millay.
Justice denied in Massachusetts. Let us abandon then our gardens and go home and sit in the sitting room. Shall the larkspur blossom or the corn grow under this cloud? Sour to the fruitful sun.
And I read it and sat down, and my friend who sat beside me went up to the professor, and she said, "Do you know who Jeanette Jeanette Parmenter was?" "No, why?" And she said, "Well, you just handed her the poem about Sacco and Vanzetti case in Massachusetts, and she's the daughter." And well, of course, the professor was stunned into silence.
Oh, pour me a drink of Italian red wine and let me taste it and call back the mind. Once more in my thoughts and once more in my soul. This story is great, if not greater than all.
Well, what